just the first half of this chapter 20 PowerPoint because it's long and involved in detail. I'm going to post it up again. I'm probably, I might not say anything on tape, but yeah, I'm going to post it on our closed website so that no one else can access it. But I'm going to put it up. Again, it's called We Shall Overcome. So in part, a lot of the images are going to be things I want you to pay attention to. I want you to pay attention to the rhetoric, the way that people are describing their circumstances and events. Also keep in the back of your mind this ideas about what's happening now, right? What's currently happening in our state. So think about how people are describing their circumstances and how folks might be describing their circumstances in 2015. These images and this rhetoric will really help us have a better discussion about what civil rights activism meant, what the freedom struggle started to look like, how it would change over time, who many of the key players are, how ordinary people are really going to be the heroes of this movement, men and women, black and others are going to be central to this movement. This is interesting in and of itself. Women carried a police patrol wagon during demonstration in Brooklyn, New York, 1963. Just in this one picture, you get quite a number of things. All right, so when we back up and actually analyze this, you can see quite a number of things happening here. This woman, first of all, is in New York. Right? We tend to think of civil rights as only a southern phenomenon, and there are going to be some broadening of this movement, especially in the north. Malcolm X is more identified with the north than a Martin Luther King is, but nonviolent direct action is going to be this major strategy in the north, especially by the early to mid 1960s. You can see how she's dressed. She's wearing nice clothing. Really, you usually would wear your kind of Sunday best clothing when you knew you were going out to do a sit-in or a march or a boycott, and we'll talk more about that as well. Very nicely dressed with her purse and coordinated and whatnot. Police are actually putting her in the wagon in a fairly humanized way. Again, this is going to be something that changes over time as well, and again, something that's in the news right now in terms of what many see as kicking off the events in Baltimore, how the arrests are done is going to become significant. So this is 1963. 63 is really a major tipping point in civil rights, and we'll get into some of the reasons for that. 63, for example, is the year that the March on Washington happens. Right? So it's seen as this major accomplishment when King and others bring 250,000 plus people to D.C. But it's also the same year that the church in Birmingham gets blown up and the 4 little girls get killed. So what many see as kind of the low point. Right? It's the same summer as when you see the fire hoses turned on people. Right? So it really is this major tipping point in terms of what happens then. So this chapter is significant. And this is something we've already kind of laid out and kind of corresponds with your handout, this next slide. It's really laying out various phases and areas of civil rights activism, labor activism, legal activism, or what I'm calling legalism, nonviolent mass direct action or nonviolent direct action, NVDA is sometimes the acronym used for that, and then black self-determination, black power, and black nationalism. These are all things we're going to talk about over the next couple of classes. CORE is mentioned quite a bit in this chapter. CORE is an important organization, in part because they're so early. Remember, we're changing the timeline for, quote-unquote, the 60s. CORE is actually a nonviolent direct action and seen as a very militant organization as far back as the 40s. Right? And so they, in some ways, are going to set the stage for what comes later. So this talk of CORE and its influence, they're influenced by people like Mahatma Gandhi in India. These strategies of passive resistance or nonviolence are not limited to any one nation. He uses that strategy successfully in India to help India gain its independence. India gains its independence in 1947, only 2 years after World War II. So again, think about how connected World War II and ideas of democracy are. And then all of a sudden people were like, yeah, we like the sound of this democracy. Yet Britain, who was the colonial power dominating India at the time, says, no, we kind of want to hold on to India as a colony. Indians decide that's not for them, right? And this nonviolent movement there is actually going to gain India's independence. So some people say, look, if one of the largest nations in the world can gain its independence through nonviolent direct action, maybe this strategy can work other places. Martin Luther King and others are going to study Gandhi and these tactics and these strategies and import them to this context. We've talked about some of the Supreme Court decisions. Obviously, the chapter goes into much more detail about the various local and state level cases that ultimately culminate in a decision like the Brown versus Board case. The Brown versus Board legal decision is ultimately going to lay a foundation so that people can become more active in civil rights. Because now the law has changed. Right? And once the law has changed, you have at least some kind of foundation to stand on to try to force people's behavior to change. There are earlier events as well, the journey of reconciliation. People getting in buses and cars and driving, especially throughout the South, and kind of pushing the limits of the law, right? So in this one, for example, black volunteers are instructed to take the front seats on buses, white volunteers in the back. So you're reversing the traditions of Jim Crow and sort of seeing what the reaction is going to be, right? Okay, sit up front and let's see how the society, let's see how people in Lowndes County, Alabama, or Mississippi, how do they react to this when they're seeing it for the first time, right? And you almost expect violence, even though you're being nonviolent. You almost come to expect that you might get beaten up that day or worse. Right, so we think about the courage of folks doing this on a local level, long before you get these national leaders that have become so important, like a King or Malcolm X. Right, you have people on the local level, on the state level, doing this kind of work with the help of the Supreme Court in some ways. Montgomery Bus Boycott. We may see some of this rhetoric when we see Martin Luther King. There are several reasons why this Montgomery Bus Boycott is important, I would say. 1955, I'd seen for many as kind of kicking off this phase of nonviolent direct action, although there were events earlier. 1955, when you think about the context of that year, same year Emmett Till gets lynched in Mississippi. A lot of folks are drawn to the movement and thinking about how bad Jim Crow is because of the fact that an Emmett Till could happen, right, in a quote-unquote modern society. Montgomery happens. That boycott's going to last more than a year. Rosa Parks comes out of it, obviously. Rosa Parks was an activist. She was secretary for the local NAACP. She had a lot of connections to civil rights leadership. So there's some intentionality as well as perhaps just being tired, right? It's not just the fact that she was tired and this and that. It's that she was a political activist. And she's a well-placed political activist that's going to look at public transportation once again as perhaps an opportunity to test the limits of democracy. Again, she's not the first to do it. We just read about folks doing it 10, 12 years earlier. But in many ways, she's going to be significant, and this constitutes a tipping point. They ultimately win, right? There's a boycott for a year. Ultimately, what we see is that economics is a viable goal, viable civil rights goal. What do I mean? Well, they boycott these buses for a year, right? Bless you. Especially in areas, majority black areas, where the majority of the riders may have been African American. All of a sudden, there's nobody on the buses. Right? Part of what's going to happen is bus company owners say, hey, we're taking a hit to the pocketbook. Maybe we need to think about making some changes. Sometimes you appeal to folks' moral conscience, right? Sometimes you got to appeal to the pocketbook. Maybe sometimes you can do both at the same time. Right? Perhaps that's what happens in Montgomery. Folks are losing money. These bus companies are going to go bankrupt if they don't make a change. And so you start to see bus company owners, business leaders maybe start to make attempts to think about integration as an idea. Remember, the goal of nonviolent direct action, the goal of legalism is integration. Kind of force your way into the system, open up the system so that it's available for all. So this notion of 60s activism as just a black movement, for example, is incorrect. What King wanted to do was to open up the American system so that everyone has equal access. So that these documents, these theoretical documents like the Constitution, all men are created equal, blah, 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 actually are real, and not just all men. Right? A lot of this is going to be opening up avenues for women and gender as well. Yes, ma'am?
Do you believe that that type of movement today will be equally successful?
That's part of what you're going to have to answer for your final. How do we define success? That's the first thing. What is successful? What it does do, there's an easy answer and a harder answer. What it does do is formally change the laws. And remember, we're dealing with Jim Crow laws for 100 years. Within a generation, folks actually do change the laws. And they open up physical spaces so that folks now have access to schools and businesses and these other areas. Does it end racism? No, not at all. And that becomes the harder thing. Right? That's always much harder, perhaps, than changing the law. Some people say, well, you got to have this first step before you can even think about a second step. So that's true, and that's why this question of success, I want you to think about that. What is success? What is failure? Because we will debate and argue that. especially in a context like today when some people say some things have changed, some things haven't. It's a perfect question, in fact. So you'll hear King always try to broaden this movement. Actually, when they win the Montgomery Bus Boycott, he says, don't make this victory this small. He says this victory is not just a victory for 50,000 African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama. He says it's a human rights victory worldwide. Right, so from the very beginning, he's going to broaden this movement. And it's, in essence, again, this Montgomery Bus Boycott is significant because it is the beginning in many ways. It's a beginning for King himself. 1955, Montgomery Bus Boycott jumps off in Montgomery. Rosa Parks gets arrested. Local activists kind of kick into gear, right? Edie Nixon was a local activist, for example, very familiar with Rosa Parks. He kind of asked for permission and her husband's permission to use her as part of this movement. She says yes, despite the danger involved. They invite a young minister to come to Montgomery and take over a movement that's already started. Right? When Martin Luther King comes to lead the Montgomery Bus Boycott, he's only 25, 26 years old. We think of King as this old, figure, gray-haired, established dude. Especially not now. 25, 26 years old. Right? So what that means is that the movement had already started without him. Right? There were local people on the ground, especially black women in Montgomery, that as soon as Rosa Parks gets arrested, they kick into gear. They kick into gear. In fact, there are 30,000 to 40,000 leaflets made overnight announcing the boycott. Black women in the Women's Political Council, for example, in Montgomery, say, look, we're going to boycott tomorrow. This is not an age of Twitter, right? You couldn't just get on and say, hey, don't get on the bus tomorrow. They had to physically get out and contact everybody in the city. And they were able to do so because they had these long-established networks, especially among black women. And they do it. They pull it off. So the next morning, nobody's on the bus. They're like, people are, go outside to see how full the bus is going to be. Nobody's on the bus. Right. Then they invite a young minister, an outsider, in to take over the movement, a spokesperson to kind of popularize it, to make it a national movement. That young minister is a man named Martin Luther King from Georgia, from Atlanta. So it's interesting to think about King's role. He is important, but he doesn't start this stuff. He would have been the first one to tell you. He didn't start this stuff. He didn't consider himself a hero in that sense, although he is going to become heroic in his behaviors. Nonviolence. Right? We're going to talk a lot about the strategy of nonviolence. I want you to think about the rhetoric and the strategies and the tactics used to try to achieve this goal of civil rights, human rights. And we'll talk more about that. King is always going to reinforce that nonviolent direct action is the way. He's going to believe that it's the best tactic to use to achieve what you want to achieve. Now, there's been some arguments about whether King himself was totally nonviolent. Martin Luther King, we think of him again as this nice guy, right? Never get riled up, middle class, kind of calm figure. He was a very intense, passionate figure. In a lot of ways, there's a story about him jumping out of a second-story window at one point because he was so just angry and angst and this kind of behavior. There's one point where he says, I don't know if I can do this nonviolent stuff. If somebody hits me, my instinct is to hit them back. But he says, you know what? In terms of the overall community, this is the best strategy. If we attack violently, we're only 10% of the population. They got the guns, they got the tanks, we'll lose. It'll be suicide. So he comes up and studies the strategy of nonviolence and comes to assert that it's the only way to achieve these goals, right? Nonviolent direct action is a way to kind of change your enemy's mind, right? To change your enemy's mind. We'll talk more about that as we work our way through this stuff. Is Rosa Parks being fingerprinted after her arrest? Again, you get a certain image, right? Middle class, well put together. They can't sort of impugn her character. Remember, stereotypes of black women. Right? These are still prevalent stereotypes. Sexuality, dirty and lazy. She doesn't look any of that, right? She's going to be the perfect person to play this part. So again, think about the images. We know some of this stuff. Parks had 2 decades of civil rights credentials. Her arrest is going to unite the Montgomery black community. Right. The boycott quickly translates into action. Again, 30,000 leaflets printed overnight, especially by black women. King is selected to lead this movement. This is going to be the beginning of his sort of national political career, which is going to last 13 years. And again, we tend to think of King as being on the stage forever, but Martin Luther King is dead by age 39. He never saw his 40th birthday. So this is a very relatively short amount of time. And even his changes over time that we'll try to trace, who knows where he might have ended up politically. Especially for the last couple of years of his life, he's going through some major changes in his thinking on some of these issues. This is a picture of a speech, the Whole Street Church during the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Black churches are going to become the center for the civil rights movement, right? Black ministers are many of the leaders for the movement. Why do you think that might be the case? Why might black ministers be a kind of natural leadership group of a major movement like this? Why do you think?
Because in that time, religion was so was held at such a high standard that those were the people that led you anyway. Because most black people all went to church, so those people were the ones that led your life. So if they told you to be peaceful, you took what they said.
Exactly. There are the natural leadership group. It's a long tradition of Christianity, especially in the African American community and other religious beliefs, but especially Christianity. So ministers were already this natural leadership. You knew who they were. You trusted them. Any other reasons why you think black ministers might be natural leaders of a movement like this? A secular movement, essentially, right? Because usually they're religious leaders. So this is a non-religious kind of thing, although obviously religion's in it. This is about rights. There are a couple of reasons. They were in the community. Okay, you see them every day. You know where they live, right? If you have a problem, you can voice it to them. You can reach them. If I have, I want to reach my leader, right? How difficult is it for me to talk to Barack Obama today? Right? I mean, I could try to tweet him, right? He may or may not get that. I could write him a letter. He may or may not get that. But these are leaders that you see every Sunday in church. They might come pray for you. You might come have dinner at your house. So yeah, they're very attached to the community, yet also have a mouthpiece to kind of speak outside the community and connect with other communities. There's another reason. Ministers tend to be very independent. Think about most people, most African Americans at this time, and who they worked for, right? Who writes their checks. Most black women are working as domestics. Most black men are working in factories or for some other, especially for a white person. If you tried to vote in the early 1960s, what often happened is you got fired. I heard you tried to vote. Yeah, I'm going down there. Well, you don't have a job anymore. Who's going to fire a black minister? Who pays their checks? The community. Comes out of the offering or whatever. So in terms of being able to speak with an independent voice, they're perfectly placed, probably the best place. Teachers can get fired, unfortunately. Can't fire a minister, at least not nearly as easily. So think about the role of, you'll see how many ministers kind of pop up in these these moments. 381-day boycott. You can read all this stuff here. James Lawson is another minister. He's still around. He's actually teaching a class on civil rights right now in California. But it's really going to inspire this whole new generation of leadership. James Lawson, Diane Nash, men and women that are going to start to study nonviolent direct action, put it into practice, embed themselves in various communities, and take moves and make moves in terms of speeding up this civil rights process. Plans are made for a lunch counter sit-in. The sit-in movement, as you'll see on the timeline, is something that picks up. Sit-ins had gone back as far as the 1930s, yet they really pick up beginning in 1960 because college students are going to become the primary sit-in activists. You can see some pictures here of what a sit-in might look like. Folks your age decide, you know what, I'm going down to Woolworths, which was one of the places at the time. I'm going to go sit at the lunch counter. You can go down there, they don't serve black people in there. We're going to go down there, we're going to sit in. The strategy is to sit there, not let anyone else sit. You come with 10 of your thing, the whole class goes down, right? There's 10 seats at the bar. 10 of you walk in and sit down and say, we want to be served. Waitress says, we don't serve Negroes here. You need to go to the back door, maybe you can get a takeout. No, we want to be served here. Our money's just as good as anybody else. Get my manager. Managers would come over and say, you need to leave, you're in violation, blah, blah, blah. Police would come. But usually before the police came, that wasn't what you were mostly afraid of. You were mostly afraid of the crowd, the community. You can kind of see the community in action here. So there's a couple things you should notice about this picture. First of all, this is an interracial sit-in. The guy on the end is a white guy, and you see they're not treating him much better. A lot of times they got treated worse because they were seen as being traitors to the race. Women at the forefront, they're not being treated very nicely. Ketchup poured on you, mustard, My mother was involved in civil rights, actually in the North mostly, but also in the South. And she talks about these sit-ins and going into places and sitting in, and the reaction that they would get. Not a good reaction. I don't think I could have done it. I'm going to be honest with you. She talked about some of the guys behind them standing back there yelling things at them. Look at this now, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Let's talk about guys pulling down their pants, urinating on them, spitting on them. See, that might have been it right there. You know what? Waitresses pouring hot coffee on them. Oh, you're not going to get up? Okay. I mean, this is dangerous and difficult things to deal with. They have to take it. Right? They have to essentially remain nonviolent throughout this process. That was the tactic. That was the strategy. The goal was almost to provoke this. Why would you do that? Why would you want to provoke this kind of reaction? How is that going to benefit you? Why do you think that nonviolent direct action as a strategy would work? Why would you want this to happen? Media attention. First of all, somebody's taking a picture, right? This picture, we know that it happened because of the picture. And especially moving into this era of television, right? This is going to be really important in the era of television. Because it's one thing to read a newspaper article, yeah, they put ketchup on them. Okay, that sounds bad. To see it, like, ooh. And then to see it in moving pictures on TV over your dinner, right, with your family, you're like, dang, they just hit that person in the head with a brick because they wanted to eat a hamburger. A lot of people are sort of forced off the fence in terms of civil rights. Right? A lot of people see it and say, this ain't right. Like, this isn't right. We need to do something to change this country. So it's going to draw a lot of people, millions of people, into the movement that hadn't really been involved in the movement before. That was the strategy. You almost knew that you were going to get beaten up that day. How these folks dressed? Nicely. You didn't come out with sweatpants on and some Dickies. You wore your little Sunday suit. Which, again, seems strange. You're going to wear your best suit to go get beaten up and dragged through the streets and have ketchup thrown on you? You know, wear your Sean John or whatever the hot clothing is. But it's about that image, right? It's about presenting that image. If you get beat up with your Sunday best and old ladies and stuff, grandmothers getting beaten up, it's hard to justify that to most people. It's hard to justify that. So yeah, this could be a difficult and dangerous situation. They did train them for it. Right? You went through these trainings. These local activists would make you train first before you couldn't just get up. I'm going to sit in today. No, slow down. We're going to go through this training. Right? We'll put you in rooms like this, yell at you, shake you, and maybe beat you up a little bit. This is what you have to deal with. You cannot react. So activists talk about that those first trainings, not being able to deal with it. Just freaking out, crying. You also would try to do things like wear a nice leather jacket, right? So if you got coffee poured on you, it wouldn't burn you so badly. There were some things you could do. You couldn't stop it, but there were some things you could try to do to mediate it and make sure you would survive. They learned to, when they got pulled up the bar stools and kicked and beaten up, to cover your head and your neck, right? Cover the sensitive areas, these type. You couldn't swing back, but you could cover yourself, right? Try to defend yourself that way. Again, difficult strategy. So that's one of the reasons I point out these details, because I really want to think about this strategy. I mean, later on, especially with Malcolm X and others, are going to say that these strategies are passive, that they're weak, and that they're not useful. I know what he's saying, but we need to be careful with that. Right? This is not a weak strategy in terms of the ability of, you have to be very strong to do it. Let me put it that way. Right? I'm not sure if I could have, truth be told, for the various reasons. You could not strike back, because it wasn't just about you. Right? It wasn't just about how you were feeling. It was about the entire movement, about the entire community. It's 1960, February, Greensboro, again, the students sit-in in North Carolina. It really kicks off sit-ins nationally. So you're going to see sit-ins in every city after a while. Right? But there's a movement to these sit-ins, a national movement that happens. SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is kind of born out of Martin Luther King's organization, which was SCLC. Southern Christian Leadership Conference. SNCC is going to be important because SNCC is kind of a younger branch of the movement. People your age, 20s, 19, 18, high school student people, that are going to ultimately kind of take over much of the movement. So the movement gets younger and younger and younger. And what's interesting, as we know, young people are impatient, right? So these young people in SNCC are going to be very impatient with Martin Luther King and his movement. They say, look, you guys are old. King is probably like, dude, I'm barely 30. but in their eyes, you're old. These are old, slow tactics. We need freedom right now. So they're really going to speed up the pace of the movement in many ways. There's going to be some tension between some leaders in SNCC and some of the older leaders. We can talk about that, especially around issues of tactics and goals and what should happen. This is Max Roach's album and picture of a sit-in. So we start to see how these movements impact culture, featuring Abby Lincoln. She's one of the people, the singers you saw earlier. Point out something really quickly, and we won't work backwards. Montgomery is 1955. If you look at your timelines, in 1962, there's another important tipping point in the movement, very important tipping point. What King would basically do, like starting with Montgomery, was travel around the country. He would pick up on movements that had already started locally and popularize them. Right? Once King came, the cameras came, you got the media attention that you needed. He didn't always stay. Right? That wasn't his role. He would come, raise awareness, usually get arrested, and then they would leave. They'd go on to the next one to try to really make this a national movement. 7 years after Montgomery, after that victory, right, they've been having local victories. They come to Albany, Georgia, and they're going to take a big loss in Albany, Georgia. It's interesting the way they take the loss and their reason to take this loss. What nonviolent direct action required was a violent, disrespectful response by law enforcement, by government. Right? So you dress nice, march peacefully, get beaten up, taken to jail. People are outraged. You're trying to force people to get involved, and you're trying to force the government to get involved. After a while, Martin Luther King gets arrested, and the president's like, man, we need to make some calls, get this dude out of jail. We can't have something happen to him in jail. What if they put King in the back of the, police car and he breaks his neck? Then you're going to have riots. So the president has to get involved. Government has to get involved. So not all of the enemies of the movement were as dumb as some of them were. let me explain. There's a police chief in Albany, Georgia that says, okay, we heard Martin Luther King was coming to Albany, Georgia. I need to figure out a game plan. Chief Laurie Pritchett was his name. He figures out a game plan on how to deal with Martin Luther King and how to deal with nonviolent direct action. Now again, nonviolent direct action is a strategy. What you would do, show up to the city in massive numbers, sometimes small towns, sometimes big cities, and overwhelm the system of Jim Crow. How do you do that? Sit-ins, peaceful marches, jail-ins. There's something called jail-ins. You go and expect to get arrested. You bring 1,000 people and say you guys are all going to get arrested today. Everybody's like, okay, let's go. Now you know that the jail in Albany, Georgia only holds 200 people. So how are they going to arrest and jail 1,000 people? Right? You're overwhelming the system. Right? You make them just become overwhelmed. This is normally what happens. It overwhelms, it shuts down the city, it makes them negotiate. Well, in Albany, Georgia, he says, okay, I got a plan. This guy, Chief Pritchett, had read Martin Luther King's book, Stride Toward Freedom. He had studied some of the earlier, he did his homework. So he said, I got a plan. I got a plan for this dude. King comes to Albany, Georgia, really kind of needing a victory because it had been, kind of a lull since the last victory. And Chief Pritchett does a couple of different things to defeat Martin Luther King. First thing he does is gather all his police officers. Say, look, this is what you're going to do. You're going to arrest them, but you're going to arrest them non-violently. Do not beat anybody up. Don't mistreat them. Don't drag them. Don't throw them in the back of the police wagon. Arrest them with respect. Read them their rights. And then we'll transport them to jail. It's a shame you had to tell them that, but they did. Right? Why would he do that? Why would he say, let them arrest them violently? How would that benefit Chief Pritchett? Yeah, right. Exactly. The police are being nonviolent. They're just, these lawbreakers are arresting them nonviolent. I remember the camera. He knows the TV cameras are rolling. This is when you get into trouble, especially when the cameras are rolling. So they arrest people nonviolently. He says, okay, King's other strategy, these jail-ins. He wants to overwhelm the jails. Chief Pritchett called around to all his friends in various surrounding cities and says, look, I need to use your jail for about a month. So when these 1,000 protesters come in, when they arrest them, he doesn't take them to his own jail. He ships them out. Let me ship you out to Atlanta's jail. Let me ship you out to this jail. Let me ship you out. He never overwhelms his jail. So he can basically outlast and outweight King. Smart. He wins. Basically, he outlasts this movement. It doesn't cause them to have to negotiate, and King loses, right? You're there for a few months. You're kind of like, well, what now, right? King has to kind of leave Albany, Georgia in disgrace. Many of the younger people in the movement, SNCC and others, are like, look, this strategy don't work anymore, right? You've been doing this for 7, 8 years, getting beaten up and whatever. This is not working. What's changing? A lot of folks start to challenge Martin Luther King's leadership in 1962 after Albany. And this is really why King has to redouble his efforts. He has to have a comeback in 1963, and he knows that. You're going to have the March on Washington. You're going to have the Birmingham Campaign. Right, Birmingham was notoriously racist place, probably one of the 2 or 3 most racist and violent places in the country. Birmingham was known as Bombingham because so many bombs were thrown in the black community. Fights would drive through the black community and throw sticks of dynamite. Right. You see Montgomery and how violent the buses were already. In charge in Birmingham, Alabama was a guy named Bull Connor. The chief of police in Birmingham was a guy named, you could tell by his name, Bull Connor. You could tell he's stubborn, he's not listening to anybody. Notoriously violent and racist. So King's like, let's go there, let's go to Birmingham. If anybody's going to give us the reaction we need, it's going to be in Birmingham. So this is what they do in 1963, go to Birmingham. There are already local activists doing various things. There have been violence before. Come to Birmingham, and Bull Connor plays his role. This is the images you see of the police dogs biting kids, right? The fire hoses being sprayed at people. This stuff makes national news. But there are a couple of, some say, questionable decisions that get made in Birmingham. King was like, look, we got to be all in. This might be the end of the movement if we don't get a victory here. One of the things he decides to do, it's interesting now to think of this in light of recent events. Martin Luther King and his organization decide to use children in the movement. They decide to use children in the movement. So these marches are not just going to be parents. You got high school kids. Initially it's high school kids, and as you know, younger kids say, I want to be in that too. You got kids cutting school from junior high school, even elementary kids coming out to march, peacefully organizing in the park and whatnot. And so that's why when you see all the hoses and the dogs, a lot of those people getting bit are little kids. Some people say this is cowardly. How are you going to put kids on the front line? Malcolm X says, look, this is ridiculous. How are you going to put your kids out there to fight your battle for you? This is not a manly strategy. Others say this is, everybody in the community is affected by this. So some others say it was a great move because, again, what can you do to kids in terms of, say, work, right? Parents participate in this protest, they get fired. You can't fire a kid, right? You're not bringing money into the family for the most part. So some say kids are perfectly positioned to be a part of this movement. Again, it's not coincidental, some say, that the 16th Street Church that gets blown up in 1963 seemed to target children. Right? The bomb was placed in the basement where the nursery school or the day.
Is that the beginning of summer?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the beginning of summer?
Summer's a little bit later, so 65. 63 is Birmingham.
When is the sanitary workers strike?
That's later, 68.
Okay.
Getting there. So Birmingham is significant for that reason. All these things happen. The church bombing, 4 little girls get killed. Those of you that don't know, there's a documentary called 4 Little Girls made by Spike Lee. I actually put it in the civil rights folder in case you want to check that out. Very good. But again, it's a major tipping point, 62 and 63, in terms of this movement. Right? A lot of this stuff is contained here in this PowerPoint. Bull Connor and all that kind of stuff. King also writes an important article here that's also in the civil rights folder. He writes an article from jail. He's put in jail, and he writes an article mostly on those scraps of paper, toilet paper, and whatnot, called "A Letter from a Birmingham Jail." A Letter from a Birmingham Jail is now considered one of the great pieces of writing in American history. And he does several things in this relatively short article. He defends his own involvement in the movement, and this letter is really written to white clergymen, white ministers. Several white ministers had come out and criticized Martin Luther King. He says, look, we're in favor of what you're doing, but you're moving too fast. Right? You're pushing people too fast, too far too fast. Right? King is like, look, this is 1963. He says the Emancipation Proclamation was 100 years ago. How slow do you expect folks to go in pursuit of their freedom? He says gradualism doesn't work. It's really this very poetic crafting of an article. And again, he wrote it from jail. He didn't have access to all the resources of the library, didn't have his laptop, right? So it's amazing what he was able to accomplish. It's fantastic in terms of his defense of the movement, his defense of nonviolence as a strategy. And it really embarrasses folks. Say, look, whose side are you on? You claim to serve God. Which side do you think God would be on? So it really is a very powerful statement of civil rights that comes out in 1963. It also forces, again, this activism forces the president, especially Kennedy at this point. Kennedy becomes more heavily involved in civil rights. A couple times that Martin Luther King would get jailed, Kennedy would try to make calls and get him out. Kennedy dies in 1963, though. November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy's killed. So we don't necessarily know how far he would have gone in defense of civil rights. He dies 3 years into his presidency, and Lyndon Johnson would take over. 1964 is going to be a major tipping point. We have, it's called Freedom Summer, 1964. What Freedom Summer was these organizations decide, again, they need a national movement, they need a national stage to try to achieve civil rights. And what they do is they put a call out to especially students and young people nationwide, black students, white students, all students, come to the South, especially to Mississippi, and we're going to do voter registration drives. Right, Mississippi has very few African American registered voters, despite the fact that you have the 15th Amendment, right? There were ways to, as we've talked about, ways to remove people, disenfranchise them. And so we get more than 700 white volunteers that go south. A couple of my advisors from school were part of this. They were at UC Berkeley, and they decided to come to Mississippi, put their lives on the line, get beaten up. Some of them get killed. Right? Three civil rights workers get murdered in Mississippi, and they get buried in this concrete dam, and they find them later. It's very, FBI gets involved and stuff. And this raises the awareness, obviously. One black worker and two white workers, in fact, are killed. 80,000 people are registered by the end of the summer. So in some ways, there's some tangible victories out of this. You're getting people registered, yet it doesn't ultimately unseat the racist Mississippi Party. Right? There's an all-white primary, so African Americans are really not allowed to participate in the political process in Mississippi. And they ultimately would form their own political party, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, with Fannie Lou Hamer. Yeah.
Got the Freedom Riders.
So what?
The Freedom Riders.
I forgot them. I'm not covering everything, but you're right, Freedom Riders are important. It's very similar to the journey of reconciliation earlier. These Freedom Riders get on buses, and they say, we're going to test the limits of the system. Very much nonviolent direct action. They get on buses and they travel through the South. They get attacked, especially Anniston, Alabama. One of the buses gets firebombed. They stop it. They pull people off and beat them, beat folks nearly to death. I burn the buses. And so again, this makes national news. One cameraman is there, for example, and he's filming and actually attacked the cameraman and broke the camera. He's talking about it in one of the documentaries on civil rights. These guys were so stupid that they broke my camera, but they didn't take the film out. So there are pictures that survive of this Freedom Rides, and it makes national and international news. You have businessmen in China and Japan that see news of their hometown and these beatings, and they're like, wait a second, something has to change. So the Freedom Riders, and there's actually a really good documentary recently about this, are particularly important as well. But it's the same strategy, nonviolent direct action as a strategy. Nonviolent direct action as a strategy. This takes us to Selma in 65, and I'm going to stop here for a second. Again, I told you 65 is going to be an important turning point, tipping point. So I want you to think about the various phases. I want you to think about how people are feeling, right? There's this optimistic period. Okay, things are changing. Martin Luther King and others are on the scene. We're going to see change. But after 6, 7, 8, 9 years, getting beaten up, thrown in jail, a lot of folks are like, I don't know if I can do this anymore. There are defectors from the ranks, as they say, in terms of people that are willing to participate. And now, there's still millions of people that do, but there are many, especially younger folks, that say, you know what, we need a different strategy, a different move. And there are other leaders that are moving onto the scene that may have been preaching some different things. Malcolm X, for example, Stokely Carmichael, we're going to talk about this transition to Black Power. But Malcolm X especially, he says, look, nonviolent direct action isn't the way. He says self-defense. He always said he was a proponent of self-defense. Now, Malcolm X gets criticized for, quote-unquote, advocating violence because he sounded very different than King. A lot of media at the time said he was violent and this and that. He always said, no, I don't advocate violence, I advocate self-defense. If someone hits you, then defend yourself. He never advocated attacking first, but if they swing at you, as he said, make sure they never swing at anybody else again. It's interesting that both, and I want to do some comparisons between the two. It's interesting that both of these figures, say Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, saw themselves as advocating a more militant, kind of manly strategy. I would say that Martin Luther King, in many ways, saw himself as advocating a kind of new Negro. We're going to get out. We're going to get involved in our own freedom. We're going to push the limits of it. That's very different than the Sambo. Malcolm X and others are going to criticize this movement. They're going to say that it's too passive, that you're not going to be respected unless you really take an active role in your own freedom. That nonviolent direct action, that sit-ins, that jail-ins don't make any sense. Malcolm X thinks that in some ways that King is leading people to slaughter. How are you going to have people walk out to police that you know is going to beat them up and tear gas them, spray them with hoses, right? And the fire hose, the fire hose thing too. We think of fire hoses, it kind of looks like, oh, that might be fun, right? Playing in the water. But that was not the case. These fire hoses had tremendous power. Some activists talk about fire hoses, that the pressure being so high that it could take the bark off trees. So when you see people get hit by them and flip and all that, you could really get tore up by that, and that's why they did it, to try to disperse the crowd in that way. You said what? I couldn't hear you.
The fire department?
Yeah, the fire department would be called in essentially to do that. Yeah, and so when you think about the police and fire department as agents of protection, but some came to see them as part of the system. Some came to see them in that way.
Didn't they I don't know if they killed Carmichael though. Did that actually though?
Did what? They killed?
Stokely Carmichael.
No. Carmichael's going to live. I think he died in 1994. He could outlast this period. Surprising because he was pretty radical in some of his views.
Is he still like or is he still involved in activism?
Carmichael?
Up until today?
Yeah, he remained involved in activism all the way. I saw him speak at UCLA in 1994. In fact, I think he may have looked a few years after that, because that was 94 when I saw him speak. But yeah, he remains involved in civil rights activism to that point.
Are you still part of the movement? I know he's quite a part, but he's still like a part of it though?
This is the question. Stokely Carmichael, for those of you that don't know him, changes his name later to Kwame Ture. But as he was known at that time, Stokely Carmichael was a member of SNCC, which was the sort of youth branch of King's organization. I told you there start to be these splits within the movement, right? The younger people think that the movement is not militant enough, not moving quickly enough, and they are starting to question the tactics of it. Stokely Carmichael is the one in 1965-66 that coins the term Black Power. He gets arrested in Mississippi, gets out of jail, comes out, jumps out on a car, and makes this speech, bless you. This speech saying, you know what, I'm not getting arrested anymore. That I'm tired of it. You can, again, think about the disillusionment. Folks being tired of getting beaten up and arrested. He's been involved in this movement for at least 6 years by this point. He says, I'm not getting arrested anymore. He says, what we want now is Black Power. And this is going to be a strategy that's going to freak folks out. And so this is why we start to see this shift by the mid-60s to strategies of Black Power. And this strategy of black power would look a lot more like the rhetoric of Malcolm X than the rhetoric of Martin Luther King. We're going to look at this rhetoric specifically in the next class. But it's interesting, these same figures, right? It's not all these different figures that, start advocating different things. A lot of them go through changes in the course of the movement. Again, if you came to this class every Tuesday, Thursday for 15 weeks, and as soon as you walk through the door, I smacked you in the face, how many times you going to walk in and just let yourself get smacked in the face? About day 2, some of you would walk in with a bat, and I wouldn't be able to smack you in the face. About day 3, some of you might just run in and just kick me before you even get in the door, right? Is that right? No, technically no, neither one of us is right. Use of violence. But a lot of folks get disillusioned and tired of what they see as mistreatment and institutional and long-term mistreatment by various folks. Of course, Module 4 is up. If you haven't seen it yet, a bunch of materials here. The congested terrain article that we looked at, Chapter 19 lecture. There are videos up here, and there are some additional readings and things that I'll make reference to a little later. I want to point out a couple of the videos real quick in the time that we have, because again, I want you to think about King and X together. I want you to think about King and X together. It's interesting because we tend to think of Martin Luther King coming first, then Malcolm X, then like the Black Panthers and these more radical groups. It's not really true. It's not really true historically. In fact, King and X overlap for most of their career. And they have a lot of similarities. Martin Luther King is born in 1929. He dies in 1968 at age 39. Malcolm X is born in 1925. He's dead actually 3 years before Martin Luther King in 1965, February 21st. Also 39 years old. So both of them lived to be 39. Both of them have about 12 or 13-year careers, political careers. Malcolm X, give you some quick background on him. We can do more of that next time, I think. But yeah, they have similar careers in many ways, and they overlap. So I want you to think about their similarities as well as some of their differences. Then I want to sort of complicate King a little bit. We think of King as this nice, passive figure, but in many ways he's going to especially be moving more towards militant rhetoric, especially by the end of his life. Yes.
I was just ask, then like towards the end of Malcolm X's career, didn't he start to like become more peaceful and like say, by any means it's not necessarily the way it is.
Yeah, both. Goes on the Hajj to Mecca. In the last 2 years of his life, he did see a number of things differently. We're going to talk a little bit more about it next time. But yeah, a lot of early Malcolm X. I'll show you some of his rhetoric. Early Malcolm X, he was serious. This is when you saw him talk about white people are devils and they smell like dogs and blonde hair. He was saying some stuff in the late 50s and early 60s that right now would get you in trouble saying. Right? He took it there. He really, really took it there. Now, after the Hajj and stuff, he would reevaluate some of that. And a lot of it has to do with his background and his upbringing. So that's what I want to deal with right now. So we'll talk a little bit more about it because I want to give it a little more time. But their backgrounds are going to be different, very different. Martin Luther King's background is he was like third generation minister, fairly middle class, and out of Atlanta. Malcolm X's background is, interestingly enough, Malcolm X's father, as we've already said, was also a Black Baptist minister. But his father was also a part of Marcus Garvey's UNIA. So he had this kind of black nationalist background and upbringing. He talks about going to some of the meetings with his father before his father gets killed. Malcolm X's father gets killed by essentially Klan. They beat him up, tie his hands, and throw him on the trolley tracks. His father gets run over by a trolley, almost cut in half. So you can imagine why someone would be a little angry, right? You could imagine. After his father was killed, his mother kind of, she's going through it. She kind of has a breakdown. They had a life insurance policy, but the life insurance said that his father committed suicide, so they don't pay them the money. Despite the fact that his hands were tied and he was still on trolley tracks, they denied them their claim. Ultimately, the family is broken up. Malcolm X is thrown in the system, goes to various foster care places, talks about how bad that was. Goes to school, tells the teacher he wants to be a lawyer. The teacher says, black people can't be lawyers. Talks about that disillusionment. Ultimately gets involved in a life of crime. Goes to jail for 6 years. So his background is very different than Martin Luther King. When he comes out of jail, he's converted to the Nation of Islam. He's going to become a minister, a for them, the national minister and such. But it's interesting to think about how background might play into this as well. We talked about this when we talked about Booker T versus Du Bois, right? How does one's background perhaps influence what you might say and do? I'm not going to play the March on Washington speech right now, I don't think. Because there's some, actually, I do want to play it. I want to play a bit more of it than we're used to hearing if it works here. Again, we usually get snippets of this speech, like the I Have a Dream part, but I want you to pay attention to a couple of important things here in this speech, 3 or 4 different things. One, pay attention to how much King talks about economics in this speech. How much does he reference economics? 2, that's April Randolph right here. 2, how does he reference kind of America's ideals? You'll hear him talk about the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson. I imagine King is kind of like a hip-hop artist. He's a hip-hop artist that samples earlier things, right? Sample what you want to use and then use it for your own purposes. So he's going to sample Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson and these folks and say, look, we need to live up to these ideals. Geography. How often is he going to make reference to different parts of the U.S., right? Because people are coming from all over the U.S. Look at the crowd. Right? And this is bringing people into a national movement. And then nonviolent direct action as a strategy. Here, how many times does he mention nonviolent direct action as a strategy? Derek, your question?
I was just going to say, you know, Malcolm X was speaking out a couple of years before King was debuted on the scene.
That you said Malcolm X was before King?
Yeah, he was speaking out on you know, on the movement for a couple of years before King was even debuted, though.
Not really. He gets out of jail in '52. And so he starts working his way up the ranks in terms of being a minister. He's really a national minister by '55, which is the same year that the Montgomery Bus Boycott happened. So they're kind of on the scene really at the same time. Maybe a little bit before he started to make a name for himself. Malcolm X is. But I mean, he's in jail until '52.
I remember there was like at least like a couple of years, though.
He's in jail at '52, so he wasn't doing too much talking. Not yet. But it's interesting because we tend to think of Malcolm X as coming after, but really King outlasts Malcolm X by 3 years. But Malcolm X's ideas would outlast some of this stuff. Again, really quickly, and part of this, and you have it online, so you can hear it. Maybe not. Maybe you got to listen to the whole thing online. Again, those 4 things I want you to pay attention to. There's a lot in this speech. Again, this is considered one of the great speeches of American history generally. But I want you to think of particularly things like economics, which we don't normally associate with King. Nonviolent direct action as a strategy that he's always going to emphasize. He emphasized that in pretty much every speech.
In the flames of withering injustice, it came as the joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100